everyone, I'm Walt Emmerichs. Today I have prepared 3 different horror stories in one video. If you like the video, you can click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Turn off all the lights. Put on your headphones and let's dive into the depths of these stories together. Forgive the length of this message. This is the first and possibly the last time I'll have access to a computer, so I thought I'd better write this all down while I can and get it to those who should know. I'm leaving town. I don't know where I'm going. I'm just getting as far away as I can. Okay, so as some of you may know, I took out a loan and opened my own auto shop a little over a year ago. Business has been going decently well. I can't complain, and I've always been grateful to all of my customers who would come to me exclusively when God knows there are so many already established places in town. I've been doing well enough that I was able to hire on my buddy Neil a few months ago, and he's been working hard and helping out really well, as I always knew he would. Well, I needed to take a day and go to a Lamaze class with Rebecca last month, and so I entrusted the shop to Neil for the morning and most of the afternoon. That's the day I think everything actually started, because when I got back, he seemed to be in a stupor and was covered in oil. He'd even had some smeared across his face, as if he'd tried to drink it or something. I told him to go home and clean himself up because we had no clients at the moment, and I could take care of anyone who came in for the time being. He came back 45 minutes later, but he was still much quieter than usual. He worked as well as he ever did, but something just seemed off about him. I asked him if anything happened while I was out, and he just shook his head. I asked how many clients we had, and he just muttered something unintelligible. I asked him to repeat himself, and he turned and glared at me, and for the briefest moment, I could have swore his eyes appeared to be completely black. No iris, no sclera, just utter all-consuming blackness. I stumbled back and bumped a shelf, knocking things down. When I looked back at him, he was still looking at me. But he didn't seem to be glaring hatefully the way he had before. He just seemed kind of out of it. Just a couple, he answered. Some woman and then a tattooed biker-type looking dude. I assumed one of them must have asked for an oil change, and that's when he spilled it. So I asked if he had any trouble, and he simply shrugged. I had looked around the garage while he was gone, and I saw no traces of an oil spill. So whatever had happened, he must have gotten it all on himself, and none of it anywhere else, miraculously. But he seemed reluctant to talk about it, so I didn't press the issue, and we worked on throughout the day. That day and the next were relatively normal other than him still being awkward and quiet. I asked him if he'd like to go out and get us lunch while I tended the shop, and he said sure. When he came back, I was busy doing a diagnostic for a client. So he put the food on the counter in the office to wait for me, and he went ahead and ate. I finished up with that customer. We'd have to keep her car overnight to figure out just why I kept dying on her. So I asked Neil to give her a ride home, and then I went to grab my food. He'd brought me some Chinese food and an iced tea. So I opened the soy sauce packets to pour some over my food when I noticed the strangest thing. It was as if the soy sauce was a living thing somehow, spreading out like dozens of squirming, inky black maggots when it fell into the fried rice and burying itself inside. I took the fork and started to scoop out the rice to look deeper inside, and small smoky tendrils would rise from the rice occasionally and dissipate. I was incredibly hungry at that point, but I was way too creeped out to eat that, so I chucked it and the iced tea in the garbage and decided I'd just wait till I got home that evening to eat something I had prepared with my own hands. I'd never in my life seen anything remotely like that, and I couldn't even fathom how I would ask Neil if he'd noticed anything similar. As cold and distanced as he'd been lately, I was sure he'd look at me like I was Looney Tunes. So I just shut up about it. That Friday we went down to the OL watering hole as we always do to get some drinks and watch the local bands play. And Neil was just as quiet and distant as he had been all week. He's not a bad-looking fellow, though. And so despite him not really going out of his way to speak to anyone, a woman went over to where he was sitting and started talking to him, and they ended up leaving together that night. Monday morning, I tried breaking the ice by asking how his weekend went. He gave me a nod and muttered, "All right." I asked him if he got lucky with that young woman I saw him with, and he gave me the smallest grin, which was quite possibly the first grin I'd seen on his face in a week, and said it went well. I didn't pressure him for details. I knew he'd share if he chose to, and his small grin was enough to assuage my worries and lend me some hope that he might get back to his old self soon. The day was relatively busy until about 3 p.m., so I finally had a spare moment to sit in the office and listen to the radio while I waited on the next client. So there I was, leaning back in my chair with my feet propped up on my desk, when I swiveled around and looked at my bulletin board that sits behind my head with all manner of clippings stuck to it. I had a few Sunday comic strips such as Garfield and Calvin and Hobbes that I'd read maybe 100 times since I'd opened shop there, but that day something was different. The first panel seemed normal, but in each subsequent panel, inky black tendrils crept out from the edges of the frame and from behind the characters. Blood dripped from the ears and eyes, and sometimes even their noses, and in each of the strips one of the characters would say, "He comes." I sat staring in astonishment for a moment before I realized the tendrils were moving ever so slowly, and then each of the characters' heads turned ever so slowly towards me, and I threw myself back away from the bulletin board, sliding over my desk and onto the floor. I ran out into the garage and yelled for Neil. I could not be the only one to see this. To my surprise, he had gone, and so I hesitantly walked back to the office and peered inside. The comics were still corrupted, but they no longer appeared to be moving. I crept over to it and reached out to pluck one of the comics free when I noticed the inky black tendrils starting to seep across the page towards where my fingers were at least 3 times as fast as they'd moved before, and I jerked my hand away. Nothing good could possibly come from letting that blot of ink touch my skin. Of course, I ripped the entire bulletin board down, burned it in a tin trash can out back, and never spoke of it again. That night I went home and my wife was already in bed, fast asleep. My mind was racing, and I couldn't even bring myself to eat dinner that night. With no one to vent my worries to, I fell into a restless sleep and kept awaking to nightmare after nightmare, seemingly every hour of the night, until I just gave up on sleep entirely. That Friday I went to the bar again. Even though my wife couldn't drink, being pregnant and all, and Neil wasn't really any fun to hang with anymore, and none of my other friends could seem to be reached. I just needed to get a good buzz, and I'd start feeling better, I reckon. After downing a couple beers, I excused myself to the restroom when I noticed I was more inebriated than I'd estimated. So I leaned over the sink to splash some water onto my face, and that's when I heard it. Like a sheet of fabric being dragged across a floor, a voice rasped ever so quietly out of the drain. It sounded like a prolonged exhale for the longest time until I finally recognized words hidden amongst all those vowels. "He comes." Cracks appeared in the porcelain, snaking out from the ring around the drain. At least, they looked like cracks at first, but after a few seconds I recognized them as the same tendrils of corruption I'd seen in the comics earlier that week, snaking their way slowly along. I stumbled backwards out of the bathroom door and right into someone's chest. I turned around and stared up into the pitch-black eyes of a 6.5-foot biker with tattoos covering every piece of exposed skin besides his hands and head. I stumbled quickly away from him, and his evil, piercing gaze followed me as I retreated through the bar. It felt like a dream, where whenever you're running for your life it feels like running through quicksand. As I walked across the room, I noticed the biker wasn't the only one staring at me. It seemed every pair of eyes in the place were focused on me, and more than half of those eyes appeared to be perfectly black, with no hint of iris or sclera. A few lips moved, and though I couldn't hear their voices over the sound of the jukebox, I could easily guess what they were saying. "He comes." I didn't get a wink of sleep that night. I haven't been getting much sleep for the past couple of weeks, as a matter of fact, which I'm guessing those of you who've spoken to me recently could have guessed. I keep seeing those pitch-black eyes staring at me. I'm afraid everyone I see will turn and whisper those words to me, staring deep into my soul with that evil glare. Every time I go near a sink or go to grab a bite to eat, I'm afraid I'll see those inky snaking tendrils squiggling towards me. Even my wife has seemed cold and distant lately. Then tonight as I'm driving home from work, struggling to keep my eyes open so that I don't drift into oncoming traffic, my cell phone rang, and it was Rebecca. She was on her way to the hospital to have our baby, and for the first time in 2 weeks, I was actually happy. She was in the labor room strapped to a monitor when I got there, watching for her contractions. She barely noticed when I walked in, but didn't seem startled when I sat down beside her and took her hand in mine. I tried talking to her, but she was unresponsive, and I was so tired I didn't even realize I had started to drift off to sleep until the nurses came in and started moving her to the delivery room about a half hour later. I put on my scrubs and a hairnet and went in with her to hold her hand and coach her through like they'd trained us in Lamaze. When she started cursing and screaming, I was prepared for that, as well as her ever-tightening grip on my hand. But when I saw the movement in her tummy, my mind started to reel. The doctor said the baby was crowning and told her to push. I echoed his orders, and she screamed at me with a voice I couldn't begin to describe. When I looked down at her, she was staring up at me with those same eyes I'd seen on the biker, the same eyes I thought I'd seen on Neil weeks before. I tried to jerk my hand away, but she maintained her grip. Black tar-like blood splashed the front of the doctor's scrubs, but he seemed to pay no heed. When I looked at her tummy again, black veins seemed to stand out beneath her skin, pulsating. She continued to stare at me, and she was no longer screaming, just grinning, those obsidian eyes boring into me. To invoke the Nispertian hive mind of chaos, she breathed in a raspy voice. "He who waits behind the wall," the doctor continued as he stared down at the child, my child, lying silently, cradled in his blood-stained hands. He looked up and raised the baby, and it appeared to be covered in oozing inky black liquid, much like that had covered Neil a couple weeks prior. It did not cry out, but it was alive, and it moved when he held it up. When its eyes opened, they were as black as my wife's, as black as the doctor's. In unison, they all breathed his name. Zalgo. I ripped my hand free of my wife's iron grip and stumbled out of the room, barreling into the nurses passing in the corridor just outside. When I stood up and looked back into the room, I could see the inky black tendrils seeming to extend from the doctor and my newborn across the floor to where I stood. I turned and ran down the hall to the elevator and slammed my finger into the buttons. When I looked back, the tendrils had come into the hallway, yet no one else seemed to notice until it slithered over their feet and up their legs, at which point they abruptly stopped, turned and looked at me with those same obsidian eyes. I abandoned my effort to call the elevator and broke into a panicked run for the stairs. I ran down the 15 flights of stairs all the way to the lobby, tore ass out into the parking lot, hopped in my car and started driving. I didn't know where the fuck I was going. I just had to get the fuck away from there. I don't know if I'm going crazy. It certainly seems like it, but I just can't be around anyone I know anymore. They all have those same eyes and those same dead stares, and even my child, oh God, my baby. I still saw those eyes staring at me from the cars beside me, and by some strange coincidence, the same biker from the previous Friday night at the bar pulled up beside me an hour away from the hospital and followed me for nearly 2 miles. He'd turn and stare at me, grinning. I couldn't see his eyes through his sunglasses this time, but I knew it was the same guy. His tattoos seemed to move of their own free will. The flaming skull on his right bicep began bleeding from its eye sockets. As soon as I could, I slammed on my brakes, allowing him to fly past me as I swerved to my left and did a U-turn. I think I lost him. That was about an hour ago. I'm at a motel 3 hours out of town. The first place I found that is Wi-Fi, and I'm tired, and I'm shaking, and my hand itches where my wife's nails scratch me open. I honestly don't know what to do or who I can turn to. This story will sound insane, and I'll probably be institutionalized, and I'm not sure that wouldn't be the best thing for me, but I just can't bear to look into those eyes anymore. Every time I see someone new and they stare at me, I start to panic because I just know it's out there looking for me. WHATVRITIS. It was a nice summer day. My 5-year-old son James was playing outside in the backyard of our suburban home. James has always been a quiet boy. He plays by himself mostly. He never had many friends, but he has always had a wild imagination. I was in the kitchen feeding our dog Fido when I heard what sounded like James talking to someone in the backyard. I'm not sure who it was he could be talking to. Could he have finally made a friend? Being a single mom, it's hard for me to always keep an eye on my son, so I decided to go outside and check on him. When I went into the backyard, I was a bit confused, because James was the only person back there. Was he talking to himself? I could have sworn I heard another voice. "James, it's time to come inside." I called out to him. He came inside and sat down at the kitchen table. It was about lunchtime, so I decided to make him a turkey sandwich. "James, who are you talking to out there?" I asked. James looked up for a moment. "I was playing with my new friend," he said, smiling. I poured him some milk and continued to pry, as any good mother would. "Does your friend have a name? Why didn't you ask him to have lunch with us?" I asked. James stared at me for a moment before replying. "His name is Laughing Jack." I was a bit taken back by what he had said. "Oh, that's a strange name. What does your friend look like?" I asked, a bit confused. "He's a clown. He has long hair and a big swirly cone nose. He's got long arms and baggy pants, with stripy socks, and he always smiles." I realized my son was talking about an imaginary friend. I suppose it is normal for kids his age to have imaginary friends, especially when he has no real kids to play with. It's probably just a phase. The rest of the day went by as per usual, and it was starting to get late, so I put James to bed. I tucked him in, gave him a kiss, and made sure to turn on his nightlight before I closed the door. I was pretty tired myself, so I decided to go to bed not long after. I had an awful nightmare. It was dark. I was in some kind of rundown amusement park. I was scared, running through an endless field of empty tents, broken down rides, and abandoned game huts. The whole place had a horrible look to it. Everything was black and white. The prize stuffed animals all hung from nooses in the game huts, all with sick grins stitched on their faces. It felt like the whole park was looking at me, even though there wasn't another living thing in sight. Then suddenly, I began to hear music play. The sounds of Pop Goes the Weasel being played on a squeeze box echoed through the park. It was hypnotizing. I followed its tune to the circus tent, almost in a trance, unable to stop my legs from moving forward. It was pitch black. The only light came from a single spotlight, shining on the center of the big top. As I walked toward the light, the music slowed down. I found myself singing along, unable to stop. All around the mulberry bush, the monkey chased the weasel. The monkey, though, 'twas all in fun. The music stopped right before its climax, and suddenly the light shot on. The intensity of the lights was practically blinding. All I could see was a small dark silhouette shuffle towards me. Then another one appeared, and another, and another. There were dozens of them, all coming toward me. I couldn't move. My legs were frozen. All I could do was watch as the haunting figures drew nearer. As they got closer, I could see. They were children. As I looked at each one, I noticed they were all horribly disfigured and mutilated. Some had cuts all over their body. Others were severely burnt, and others were missing limbs, even eyes. The children enveloped me, clawing at my flesh, dragging me to the ground and tearing inside me. As the children tore me apart and I faded away, all I could hear was laughter, horrible, awful, evil laughter. I woke up the next morning in a cold sweat. After taking a few deep breaths, I looked over and saw that a few of James' action figures were positioned facing me on top of my nightstand. I sighed. James had probably woken up early and put these here. I gathered up the toys and made my way to James' room. However, when I opened the door, James was sound asleep. I just shrugged and placed the toys back into his toy box and headed out to the living room. A little while later, James woke up, and I made him his breakfast. He was quiet and seemed a bit groggy. Perhaps he didn't sleep well either. I decided to ask him about the toys. "James, honey, did you put the toys in Mommy's room this morning?" His eyes shot up at me for a moment, then quickly glanced back down at his cereal. "Laughing Jack did it." I rolled my eyes and responded, "Well, you tell Laughing Jack to keep the toys in your room. James nodded and finished up his breakfast, then decided to go play out in the backyard. I went to relax in the living room, and I must have dozed off because I woke up a couple of hours later. Shit, I need to check on James. I was a bit worried. It had been over 2 hours, and I haven't checked on him. I stepped out into the backyard, but James wasn't there anymore. I was getting nervous, so I called out to him, "James, James, where are you?" Just then I heard a giggle come from the front yard. I rushed through the gate around to the front of the house. James was sitting on the sidewalk. I breathed a sigh of relief and walked over to him. "James, how many times have I told you to stay in the backyard? James, what are you eating?" James looked up at me, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of hard candies in all colors. This made me very nervous. "James, who gave you that candy?" James just stared at me, not speaking. "James, please, tell Mommy where you got that candy." James hung his head down and said, "Laughing Jack gave it to me." My heart sunk. I kneeled down to look him in the eye. "James, I've had enough of this damn Laughing Jack thing. He is not real. Now this is a very serious situation, and I need to know who gave you the candy." I could see my son's eyes tear up. "But Mama, Laughing Jack did give me the candy." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. James has never lied to me, but what he's telling me is impossible. I make him spit out the candy, and I throw the rest away. James appears to be fine. Maybe I'm just overreacting. After all, he could have gotten it from Tom and Linda from next door, or Mr. Walker down the street. Either way, I'm going to have to keep a closer eye on James. That night, I put James to bed as usual, and decided to go to bed early myself. Suddenly, I was woken up by a loud bang coming from the kitchen. I sprung out of bed and hurried down the stairs. When I got to the kitchen, I was horrified. Everything on the counters had been thrown on the floor, and our dog Fido hung dead from the light fixture. His stomach was cut open and stuffed with candy, the same type that James was eating earlier that day. My shock was quickly broken by a sharp scream coming from James' room, followed by loud crashes. I quickly grabbed a knife from the drawer and moved up the stairs with the speed that only a mother whose child is in danger could have. I burst through the door and flicked on the lights. Everything in the room was knocked over and tossed on the floor. My poor son in his bed crying and shaking with fear, a pool of urine staining the sheets. I scooped my child up and ran out of the house and went next door to Tom and Linda's house. Luckily, they were still awake. They let me use their phone, and I called the police. It didn't take them long to arrive, and I explained what had happened. They looked at me as if I were crazy. They searched the house, but all they found was a dead dog and 2 trash rooms. The officer told me that someone had probably gotten into the house and done this right before making a quick escape when they heard me coming up the stairs. I knew it wasn't true. All the doors were locked and none of the windows were open. Whatever was in my house didn't come from outside. The next day, James stayed inside. I didn't want him to leave my sight. I went into the garage and found his old baby monitor and set it up in his room. If anything comes into it tonight, I was going to be able to hear it. I went to the kitchen and grabbed the largest knife from the drawer and put it on my nightstand. Imaginary friend or not, I'm not letting anything hurt my little boy. Soon enough, night came. I put James to bed. He was afraid, but I promised him that I wasn't going to let anything happen to him. I tucked him in, gave him a kiss, and turned on the nightlight. Before closing the door, I whispered to him, "Good night, James. I love you." I tried to stay up as long as I could, but after a few hours, I felt myself drifting off. My baby would be safe for the night, and I needed to sleep. Just as I lay my head on the pillow, I heard a soft noise come from the baby monitor I had put on my nightstand. At first, it sounded like interference, like the kind of radio would make. Then it turned into a soft moan. Was James asleep? Then I heard it, the laugh from my nightmare, that horrible laugh. I sprung up from the bed and grabbed the knife from under my pillow. I rushed over to James' room and creaked the door open. I tried the light switch, but it wouldn't come on. I took a step in, and I could feel the warm, thick liquid on my feet. Suddenly James' nightlight came on, and I could see the absolute horror laid out in front of me. James' body was nailed up on the wall, the nails piercing through his hands and feet. His chest was cut wide open, and his organs hung down to the floor. His eyes and tongue had been removed along with most of his teeth. I was disgusted. I could hardly believe this was my baby boy. Then I heard it again, the soft, desperate moan. James was still alive. My baby, my poor baby, in so much pain, barely clinging to life. I ran across the room and vomited on the floor, but my sickness was interrupted by a horrible cackle coming from behind me. I spun around while still wiping bile from my mouth. Then out of the shadows emerged the fiend responsible for all this horror, Laughing Jack. His ghost white skin and matted black hair hung down to his shoulders. He had piercing white eyes surrounded by dark black rings. His twisted smile revealed a row of sharp, jagged teeth, and his skin didn't look like skin at all. It almost looked like rubber or plastic. He wore a patchy black and white clown outfit with striped sleeves and socks. His body itself was grotesque, his long arms hanging down past his waist, and the way he was poised made him look almost boneless, like a rag doll. He let out a sickening laugh, as if to let me know he was pleased with my reaction to his work. He then turned around slowly in front of James and began to laugh even more at the horrific sight he has laid out. That was enough to shake me from my terror. I snapped, "Get away from him, you bastard!" I rushed at the monster, raising the knife above my head and stabbed down at him. But as soon as the knife touched him, he disappeared in a cloud of black smoke. The knife passed right through and pierced James' still beating heart, splashing the warm blood on my face. No, what have I done? My baby! I killed my baby! I immediately fell to my knees, and I could hear sirens in the distance growing louder. My boy! My sweet baby boy! I promised Mommy would protect you, but I failed. I'm sorry, James. I'm so sorry. Police soon arrived to find me in front of my son, still wielding the knife covered in my baby's blood. The trial was short, insanity. I was placed in the Firapolo's house for the criminally insane, where I have been for the past 2 months. It's not so bad here. The only reason I'm awake now is because someone is playing Pop Goes the Weasel outside my window. I'll talk to the orderlies about it in the morning. Have you ever been influenced by clothing? I don't mean confidence by looks. Have you ever been given more control than ever by an item, or a truth, or just a favorite shirt? Have you ever been influenced in the worst way? By showing the truth? The following is taken directly from journal entries. The entries were written by a notorious but unknown killer. He is notorious in the means that everybody has seen his work. He is unknown because nobody knows that he has done it. His origin is unusual. No troubles, no evil family, no magic or paranormal forces. His life was chosen by him, and him alone. His identity is also unknown. He will be named from here on as the Hooded Man. April 3rd, 2004. It's been really cold around here. I don't have anything really to cover myself. All I have are my t-shirts and jeans. So today I decided to get a jacket. I was just in a local store. Nothing special. It's a black hoodie with a white lining. I think it looks pretty cool, and when I tried it on, the attendant said it suits me fine. I said thanks to be polite. Common courtesy is so hard to find. So I bought it. I haven't taken it off yet. Not only is it warm, but I can really see myself doing amazing things in it. When I look at the mirror, I smirk. I feel amazing. I can't really explain it, but I like it. I really like it. I feel the need to put my hood up. Something about the hood has a way of masking a person. Even though it shows their face, it hides something somewhere. It's really late right now. I've been feeling so great all day. Time flew around me. I'll have to explain more tomorrow. April 10th. I've had a hell of a week. I felt so great. I walked the halls like a big shot. I'm sure I look smug. That's why Jack challenged me. He was so angry. Who never do ignoring an insult was more insulting than responding with shrewd comments about someone's family. He antagonized me. He asked for it. He threw a hard punch, and I stood. It stung harder than before when I actually argued with him. I felt so cool all week. My confidence kept me up. I punched him hard in the stomach, and I lifted him up with an underhook. It felt so good. It really did. Parents calling. April 14th. Jack still isn't and out of the hospital. They said he's in a lot of pain. He spit a lot of blood. His parents told me over the phone. I reflected on it, on how great it felt when my fist connected, how his cracked scream sounded. That's good to hear, I said blankly. I don't care about Jack. I smiled at his pain. I keep staring. I keep staring at my mirror. I'm always wearing my favorite hoodie. It feels so empowering. My friends would laugh at what I say. They would compare me to Spider-Man and his black suit. Spider-Man threw his power away. I don't plan on doing anything with my source of confidence. April 22nd. Jack has gone to a better place. The words rang through my ears. He's dead. He lost too much blood. His father told me the day I visited that he was losing blood due to a personal health condition. But the way his mother looked at me told me the real story. I killed him. I still remember the satisfaction of hitting him. I never wanted to kill him. I need to think about what I've done, right? That'll fix my feelings. But what is there to think about? Regret is a foolish emotion. I don't need regret. April 24th. Dad has been avoiding me lately, and Mom just tells me she loves me. They both want me to feel endless guilt, but I won't, or rather, I can't. I can fake it for the public, but the truth is, I'm not sorry. Spider-Man's story is starting to make me think more. But why would a cursed or possessed hoodie land in my possession? Everybody who knew Jack glares at me. Everyone who I would talk to have transferred themselves out of my class or went to a different school. Teachers don't look at me much or get on to me if I'm breaking any rule. Today, I threw a pencil at my history teacher. It hit his shoulder. He just froze for a second and continued what he was doing. Everyone either hates me and probably wants me dead, or they fear me. My writing is the only comfort I have. I can be at peace and let myself go. April 25th. They provoked me. They threatened me. I had no choice. They would have killed me. My hood protected my face. The knife naturally moved from Rob's hand to mine. I didn't mean to. The writing was a short line at this point. April 30th. 5 days. 5 days being interrogated and sleeping in a cell. They decided I was only defending myself. I can hear Mom and Dad talking. They want me gone. They're both scared. I was an idiot to think that this jacket of mine was possessing me or changing my personality. It's just a really cool jacket. I love how it looks. I feel like such a badass. I remember how I put the hood up. I put it up when Jack challenged me. I put it up when those guys tried to kill me. I feel no remorse. I feel indifferent. I am in control. I have finally come to realize insanity. I wanted to kill them. All of them. I needed only a push and the confidence to fight. I got it. Mom and Dad are irritating me. They all irritated me. And so it comes to the end of the 3 stories from the Dark Worlds. I hope these stories give you goosebumps. If you like these kinds of stories and want to hear more, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, watch the video and comment. See you again in the next video.